Okay, so in recognizing orientation, let's start with evidence for how we as observers can recognize what somebody else's sexual orientation might be. If you took the Kinsey scale that was in the first self-assessment, there was an item that asked about whether we can recognize whether a person is gay or not based on behaviors or other, superficial clues. And the correct answer is no, according to the Kinsey scale. But what I'm going to tell you right now is that the correct answer might be maybe. So this study is from 2012, and they got people's faces off of Facebook, and then they removed, any kind of identifying, context from behind them, stuff like that, and took away their hairstyle, no hint of clothing. All you're left with is faces. And you can see in part A, the faces were upright, and then they were masked. So you would see a flash of the face for whatever length of time you were assigned to see the face, and then it would be masked by that sort of indistinct gray and white patches that you see below them. In condition B, the faces were upside down. They were inverted, and then they were masked. Okay, so here's what we see is upright is on the left-hand side, upside down faces are on the right-hand side. The target gender, so the face that was being judged, was either female, and that's the dark gray, or male, that's the light gray. And on the y-axis, you see the sexual orientation detection accuracy. And sexual orientation was determined by things that were in the person's profile. So their personal declaration of what their sexual orientation was determined to be the correct answer. And then they were looking at whether the observers could correctly recognize the sexual orientation of the target at above chance level. So in this particular experiment, the correct answers were either heterosexual or homosexual. Those were the only choices. So it was either 0 on the Kinsey scale or 6 on the Kinsey scale. There was nothing in between. So you were either right or you were wrong, right? And so you had a 50-50 chance of guessing the correct sexual orientation. That would be the chance level. So that's why the y-axis ends at 50. Now, of course, 100% would mean that you were right every time, right? So on the y-axis, if it were to go to 1.00, that would be indicating 100% accuracy, and nobody got anywhere near that. And in fact, for the men, the accuracy was lower overall than for the women, right? That were being judged, the target faces. Upside down produced poorer performance than right side up faces. But everybody's above chance, and I think we can argue that especially for the female faces, that it's significantly above chance. They were accurately detecting the sexual orientation at much better than chance level. It was not perfect. There were errors being made, but above the chance level. And so there is some evidence to suggest that we do in fact detect some kind of cue, something about expression or something that gives us a little bit of a hint that a person has a particular sexual orientation. I like to start this conversation with that because it's important for people who maybe are struggling with the coming out process to realize that they might be giving out clues that other people are picking up on, that maybe they themselves aren't even really aware of or ready to acknowledge. But other people are already picking up on the clues. And so the coming out process for the person who is in the process of coming out might be a lot scarier because they think it's going to be a surprising bit of news for their friends or their family members. And in the case of the friends and family members, it might be sort of I didn't know that you didn't know that I knew kind of experience. And so sometimes it can almost be a letdown for people in the coming out process when they finally have gotten their courage together and they tell somebody, and the person is not as shocked as maybe they were supposed to be. So let's talk about the process that people go through. It's a process of really not necessarily trying to convince the people around you that this is your sexual orientation, but instead it is really about the person themselves coming to understand, accept, and value their own sexual orientation. So it's important as friends or loved ones of a person who's going through the coming out process to recognize that it really is about them growing into their own self-identity. And part of that is being valued by people who they care about and they love, and they're worried about that. But part of it is also like getting over that hurdle of being able to say it out loud for the first time, right? Things like that. So oftentimes the first step is acknowledging it to themselves, right? That a person who's coming out as, probably anywhere on the Kinsey scale that's not a 0, right? You acknowledge that to yourself first, that you have these attractions. It could be sexual attractions. It could be romantic attractions. It could be emotional attractions that are not directed towards the opposite sex. And so then it makes the person start to question and think about it. The next step oftentimes is coming out to other members of the sexual minority community where they feel comfortable that these people are probably not going to react badly, and they're probably going to be supportive. And so a lot of times people who are in the process of coming out will start to make friends who are maybe outside of their regular friend set because they are people who belong to the LGBTQ community, and they feel that these people will be supportive. They know where they're coming from. They can imagine the situation that they're in, things like that. Ultimately, the last step is to come out to other to other members of their friend and family group that are heterosexual. That's sort of the riskiest, coming out is to people who aren't in the community and I value this relationship. I don't want anything bad to happen, and I'm just worried about how the reaction is going to be. And so that's the riskiest step. So things that the person has to consider is, what relationship do I have to the person in question? Like, it's not important necessarily for every single person I ever encounter in the entire world to necessarily know my sexual orientation. So I don't need to necessarily, to be an authentic person, share my information with everybody. I need to consider the timing of the information. It might be really super important for a tight relationship, maybe parents or a sibling or something like that. Make sure that it's being, that it's good timing, that it's a time where, they're open, they're truly listening, things like that. You don't want to blurt it out in the heat of an argument or something like that. Location, right? You want to be in a safe place where, you are comfortable that if things were to go badly, there's an escape route. That's I know that sounds like a dramatic thing to say, but it's important. Or that if the person who you're coming out to may not have the greatest, perfect, exact response that they're supposed to have, that they aren't going to be, displaying that in front of other people, things like that. What are your resources? Who can you fall back on to, maybe process the reaction that you got from a loved one or a friend? Also resources that you can offer to the person that you're coming out to, right? Like a lot of parents are unaware that there are organizations like PFLAG that are just support groups for parents who are, coming to grips with their child's sexual orientation. And it's helpful a lot of times for parents to talk to other parents, things like that. Other kinds of support that, if, for example, a lot of times when young people are worried that they have no other place to live besides with their family or with the people that they're living with right now, that if they were to reveal this about themselves, that the people who they're living with might say, we're not going to support you anymore, like literally not support you anymore. And so there's a risk, right? So the person has to decide really when's the safe and appropriate time. Now, the reason why our sexual orientations are so important to us is because it's part of our self-concept, right? Who is our family is part of our self-concept. The career that we're pursuing is part of it. The community that we connect with, and community can be lots of different communities, right? It could be the city that you live in, or it could be the people who you choose to associate with, or the clubs that you belong to. Those are all parts of your community, right? Your hopes and dreams, your fantasies for where you want to be someday in your life. And then you've got who are your friends and who is your partner, right? Those are really big components of one's self-concept. And so if you have to deny part of your self-concept just to get along in life, everybody else is talking about, the dates they went on this weekend, and you really can't talk about it because you know that they would maybe, then we get into this whole thing of coming out and I don't want to with you guys and whatever. It's like feeling like you're denying part of your self-concept. And so that's why going through this process is important, and it's difficult. And so it needs to be done on the timeline of the person who's coming out. Overall, what you're seeking to do is to live an authentic life while also avoiding discrimination and avoiding rejection, right? So we would all like to be able to live our true authentic selves, right? Where we are being honest to ourselves, not being full of denial or any of those things that John Gottman says is so harmful in relationships, where we're, stonewalling or not really wanting to deal with the truth. So all of us are seeking to live authentic lives, and all of us want to be loved. We don't want to be rejected. We don't want people to treat us badly because we belong to one group or another. And so all of us are going through this. It's just that we have, for people who are in the LGBTQ community, they from the outside, they may not have any of the characteristics that indicate traditional stereotyping and discrimination targets, but they, if a person were to know, then all of a sudden discrimination and rejection would come into play. And so that's that balance that a person really has to, kind of make, where they want to make sure that they're not, living an inauthentic life, and they aren't asking for discrimination and rejection, right? I mean, there's a lot of things to balance. So one of the things that we worry about with teenagers, who typically, most people by puberty have started to recognize that they are attracted to their same sex or the other sex. I mean, most people, as they're starting to mature, they probably have already figured out, probably well before puberty, they probably had started to have some recognition of who typically they are attracted to. So what we worry about is that, during this hotbed of, high school, where everybody's sort of figuring out, who's more dateable and all the things that we all go through during high school, we have this extra layer of angst that goes along with having this variation that can cause people to be, really unkind, right? Really, it could be physically unkind or, emotionally unkind to people who are perceived as gay or lesbian or bisexual, or who have come out as that. And so we see the percent attempting suicide among gay and bisexual males, lesbian and bisexual females. And then we see, in comparison, heterosexual males very unlikely to attempt suicide, and heterosexual females more likely than heterosexual males, but less likely than either of the gay classmates. And so it implies that there's a lot of stress and a lot of alienation that occurs among gay and bisexual males and lesbian and bisexual females that doesn't really happen in the same way to heterosexual peers. So we've made a lot of headway as far as gay rights, attitudes towards gays and lesbians over the past really 50 years, but the progress really accelerated over the past 20 years. And so I thought I would just go over some laws that have changed over time recently. Your textbook goes into a lot more of the social things that had been going on in the 60s and, overturning in the American Psychological Association. We got rid of homosexuality as a psychological disorder in the early 70s. And, it goes through a lot of those things. I thought I would go ahead and emphasize some of the laws. So this is as of 2011. And these are the states that have, the colored states are the ones that have some protection for people based on sexual orientation and or gender identity. So you'll see that the purple ones, which include the state of Washington, there is protection for people. You can't be discriminated against based on your sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, I came from California originally, and I did my PhD training in New Mexico. And in both of those two states, the sexual orientation and gender identity sexual orientation had already been protected when I moved to Washington in the mid 90s. So I came from 2 states where those were already protected. You couldn't be fired just because your boss discovered that you were gay. When I moved to Washington, you could be. And I was shocked. In 1994, I couldn't believe that Washington State, you could still get fired for your sexual orientation. It changed pretty quickly. If I recall correctly, it was 1998 that switched over. And then the gender identity got added on in the OOs. The blue states, there's only protection on the basis of sexual orientation. And it says there, all employment. That means no employer in these states can fire you just because of your sexual orientation. In the pink states and in the turquoise blue states, those you are protected if you work for the state or federal government, but not necessarily private employers. So pink is sexual orientation and gender identity. The turquoise is just sexual orientation. And then all of the gray states are states that have no specific laws pertaining to any kind of LGBT protections. And so this is something that there has been enormous headway made. I've seen just in our own state of Washington, enormous change over the 25 years that I've lived here. But, they're in the general United States, we're not seeing all states having similar laws. That's for sure. How about laws prohibiting gay and lesbian sexual behaviors? Now, this is interesting because these are what we call sodomy laws. So sodomy laws, if you look up the literal meaning of the word sodomy, it literally means anal sex. But sodomy laws refer to anything that other than coitus, anything other than penile vaginal sex. So technically, any kind of oral sex is illegal. Penetrating any orifices with an object, so any kind of dildos would be illegal, things like that. So the sodomy laws they claimed to be, ways to, prosecute, for example, rapists who did lots of different things to their victim. They would get called on sodomy laws and things like that. And they were used for like that a lot. But the truth was they were mainly used to prohibit same-sex sexual behavior. And so they were typically used against gays and lesbians. In the South, it was illegal to sell dildos. And so there would be like these underground sex toy parties, kind of like Tupperware parties. And you'd have to be on the down low, man, because they were selling illegal things. So if you look at our little chart, you'll see that Illinois repealed their sodomy laws before 78. And then the next shade of, goldenrod are the states that struck it down between 1978 and 1989. So you'll see that Washington State is in that group. The orange states struck down their sodomy laws between 1998 and 2002. And then the red states are the ones that got rid of the sodomy laws when the U.S. Supreme Court told them they had to. So the U.S. Supreme Court declared any behaviors that occur between consenting adults are fine. And one of the things that really triggered that U.S. Supreme Court ruling was that there were some men in, I thought it was Georgia, I think it was Georgia, who were in their house, minding their own businesses, having sex, when the police issued a no-knock warrant on the wrong house. They were coming in looking for drugs, and they were actually in the wrong house. And so they didn't find any drugs, but they found these 2 men having sex. And so they took them into jail, even though they had no business in that couple's house at all. So that case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ultimately made the decision that all of you guys who are still holding sodomy laws, and especially, claiming that it's to protect, to be able to really charge heavily on rapists and stuff like that, write different laws on that. You can no longer tell people what they do in their bedrooms. So the sodomy laws were all brought down in 2003. So now you can do whatever you want as long as you both consent to it. And then similarly, we had, it used to be actually that there was nothing said about same-sex marriage. The assumption was that you could only get married if one of you was a male and one of you was a female. Then people who were the same sex were asking, why can't I get married? The two of us want to get married. And so there was a long and protracted debate on that. And then slowly states started to pass laws allowing same-sex marriage. Meanwhile, at the federal level, there was an argument that there should be an amendment to the Constitution banning same-sex marriage. So there were sort of these two parallel, tracks of people discussing things. So I found this nice animation, which kind of starts really promptly there. But you see sort of it spreading across the country where they're dropping this ban. And you can see that it started in Massachusetts, and then it slowly spread to other states, adjacent states. So you see that it like here and there and here and oh no, a whole region, and then right, and it just starts spreading. And then ultimately the final, everything goes blue when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that two people can declare their intent to be married, and their sex does not determine their eligibility for marriage. So I'm going to try and get it. Oh, I couldn't do it. This is really hard. Hold on. I can't do it. Man, that's hard to capture. Let's see if my reaction time will be faster this time, because I wanted to illustrate what year it happened also, because it all just happened really fast. And there were all these votes going on and different states passing, it won't let me do it. Different states passing different laws with regard to same-sex marriage. And now I pushed the whole thing altogether wrong. One state was sort of making it legal, and then it became illegal again, and that became legal again. It was going back and forth. And, anybody who got married, it was sort of like, now is my marriage legal in another state? Like if I move to some place that doesn't have same-sex marriage, am I still married? And so it became really super confusing. And that was one of the factors that really allowed the Supreme Court to say, okay, this is ridiculous. We have to make a decision. And so they made their decision. And so now we have no more sodomy laws and no more bans on same-sex marriage. All right, so enough of me trying to push that button. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to talk about hate and its motives and things regarding sexual orientation in the next segment.